2, 1, go.
Greetings from Pretoria, South Africa. I am Dr. Pravina Sukraj Eli, the first Vice President of ICVI, and I will be the moderator for this Inclusive Education webinar. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all attendees present and a special word of welcome to our panel of experts. The objective of this webinar is to reflect on the landscape and the developments of inclusive education over the past 5 decades, where we are at present in terms of including children with visual impairment in inclusive classrooms, and the role of diverse stakeholders to advocate for, promote, and sustain inclusive education in practice. We will take a discursive approach in the webinar. You will be pleased to know that we have a panel of experts with diverse skills and knowledge, which will allow us for a range of discussions to occur today. We will range from discussing academia and research, policy and practice, as well as advocacy and implementation concerning inclusive education initiatives in developing and developed countries. I now want to highlight some webinar house rules before we begin. Attendees cannot raise your hands. However, you will be able to raise all questions that you may have in the chat box. Due to the large number of attendees that we have at the webinar and the necessity to manage the chat box, please can attendees type out the name of the panelist you wish to address your question to, and then type out your question. All questions raised in the chat box will be answered during our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Note, only panelists can see the chat, so don't be alarmed if you do not see all other questions that have been raised. There is translation available in the webinar. The options available are English, French, and Spanish. Kindly note that 5 of our 6 panelists today will be responding in English, and 1 of them will be responding in Spanish. The written presentations will be uploaded on the ICVI and World Blindness website for your ease of reference and download. Now, before we start with our discussion today, I want to take this opportunity to introduce our panel of experts to you. We have Julia McGowan. Julia is a global inclusive education specialist at Humanity and Inclusion, and today she also represents the International Disability and Development Consortium, otherwise known as IDDC. Sian Tesny. Sian is the Global Advisor for Education at CVM International. Since 1991, she has been involved in development work in inclusive education in low and middle income countries. Dr. Guy Lefano. Guy is the Senior Global Technical Lead in Education for Sightsavers, where he is responsible for providing technical support and strategic oversight for the organization's education programs in Sub-Saharan Africa and India. Professor Kay Farrell. Kay is Professor Emeritus of Special Education at the University of Northern Colorado in the US, and is currently the ICVI President for the North America and Caribbean region. She has taught children of all ages with low vision and blindness, and has also coordinated various teacher training programs. Jordi Maria Losnigard. Jordi is from Norway and is the Program Director at the Norwegian Association of the Blind and Partially Sighted. She leads the implementation of a multi-stakeholder consortium promoting the rights of persons with disabilities and disability mainstreaming in Mozambique. Ana Isabel Lopez. Ana is the Director for Education at ONCE, that is the National Organization of Spanish Blind People. So you can see that we have a wealth of expertise on our panel. With these opening introductory remarks, I want to start our discussion. Julia, I'm going to start the discussion with you. The term inclusive education was coined a few decades ago. And over the years, various developments have occurred. Can you briefly tell us about the evolution and the landscape of inclusive education as it has progressed over the years?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Dr. Pravina. So I would say that inclusive education first became more prominent globally at UNESCO's World Conference on Special Needs Education, held in Salamanca in Spain in 1994, where a statement on the education of all children with disabilities calling for inclusion to be the norm was endorsed. This was the beginning of the Education for All movement. So I'd say that was a kind of key moment to refer to. And then let's jump forward to 2006, when I'm sure many of you know the UNCRPD was adopted, which is the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, of course, as this was also a key moment for inclusive education, especially Article 24. As you know, states parties signing this convention commit to ensure an inclusive education system at all levels and lifelong learning. So just to highlight some key areas that were identified in the UNCRPD, Article 24, non-discrimination on the basis of disability, accessibility, the concept of reasonable accommodation, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you, but that came through in the Article 24 in the UNCRPD. Individual support, of course, and development of skills for life and social development. So it was a key ingredients really for what inclusive education was all about. And this is something that states were having to, commit to doing. So that's an important date. Now, there are, of course, important milestones in the intervening years too. But I think I really wanted to highlight the more recent years because there's been sort of a surge of key dates really in the last few years that have made a big difference in the development, I guess, of inclusive education internationally. So I'm fast forwarding again, this time to 2015, so not so long ago, when the development goals, sustainable development goals, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, were launched. So for inclusive education, this was a key moment. Goal 4 was on inclusive and equitable quality education. And this was important because it was the first time we had a goal, with inclusive education as part of the international goals. Like before that, there were the Millennium Development Goals, and inclusive education wasn't mentioned at all. Education was mentioned, but not inclusive education. So that was a really key moment. And another important aspect in 2015 was the fact that there was a merging of another framework, which was the Education for All movement, where they had their own education goals. These merged together with the Sustainable Development Goals to form the Incheon Declaration and Framework for Action, which is a bit of a mouthful. But essentially, this meant that there was a kind of coherent framework for everybody to be following, like a roadmap to follow, to achieve inclusive education by 2030. So I think in that sense, 2015 was a key moment for inclusive education. And it's one, to remember as a sort of important, part of the landscape really as we moved forward. But then I think since then, quite a few other key things have happened, to really add on to that. So if we move just 1 year later, in 2016, the general comment from the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability, sorry for the sound outside, on Article 24 published a much more detailed document on what Article 24 was all about, this so-called general comment. And I've got a couple of quotes I wanted to read out, just give you a flavor of the comment, but I would advise you all to, if you haven't read it, to go and look it up, because it's a really good sort of blueprint for what inclusive education is, what states are actually signing up to if they're doing inclusive education, and what it isn't. So the two quotes I wanted to mention were these: inclusion involves a process of systemic reform, with a vision serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience, an environment that best corresponds to their requirements and preferences. I think that's a really good essence of what inclusive education is and what it means. And then the next quote I wanted to mention was what we need to be wary of, because it's a pitfall that many states fall into. And this is that placing students with disabilities within mainstream classes without accompanying structural changes, for example, organization, curriculum, teaching and learning strategies, does not constitute inclusion. And I mentioned that because I think this is really key at this point. This is why it's so useful to have the general comment from 2016, because it gives us sort of evidence to go to governments to say, look, yeah, you might be saying that you're doing inclusive education, but just opening the doors to children with different disabilities does not constitute inclusion unless you're doing something, you know, to support those children. Just allowing them to enter the classroom is not enough. And this is unfortunately what a lot of states were doing and still are, in fact. So that's why it's a useful document to have and to refer to. So then if we fast forward to 2018, when IDA co-hosted the Disability Summit. Again, I guess many of you would have heard of the Global Disability Summit, the one that was done in the UK. And of course, we've got the next one coming up next year in Norway. But inclusive education was a key topic. So I think also that that's a key year for inclusive education, because there was a statement of action that was launched by many different organizations, academia, NGOs, and others coming together to launch this statement of action. And also many different organizations and states did set down commitments that they were going to do to deliver on inclusive education, such as the World Bank, for example. But there were many more. I'm just picking one. And then in 2019, so we're getting near to the present day now, so we're nearly there. In 2019, there was the UNESCO International Forum on Inclusion and Equity in Education in Colombia. This was an important conference because it marked 25 years since Salamanca, and it was a celebration really of what had been achieved in that time, but also a bit of a reckoning about what was still needed to be achieved. And so I think that was another key moment. There was a statement put out, and the Cali Statement, looking at what was, what was agreed in terms of what it means to have inclusion in education, but also, looking at there's a long way still to go to actually ensure full inclusion. The message is out there, but the sort of how to deliver it fully isn't really happening in most countries. And that was really the essence of that conference. And then in 2020, last year, although obviously COVID pandemic had played havoc with the education all around the world, and I'm sure that will come up later, it was, in fact, there were two positives in terms of inclusive education. If we just look at, if we take ourselves away from COVID-19, one was the Global Education Monitoring Report, which for the first time did an edition on inclusion in education with a really thorough look at what was the situation for inclusive education across the world, with lots of data and evidence about what was going on, what's needing to be done, what's the real situation on the ground right now. So that's a really useful moment. And finally, there was also IDA's flagship report on inclusive education as well, which was launched. And this kind of, given the surge of interest in inclusive education, it's important that everyone has a clear idea of what it means in practice. And this helped, along with other documents, to give the how rather than the what, because we now have plenty of information about what is need to be done, but we need as much as possible on how, and the evidence on what works best in which context, and how does that actually work in practice. And that has started to happen, of course, but that's where I think the area that more needs to be done, especially now in the COVID times and post-COVID, when obviously new ways of working will need to be worked through as well. I haven't kept so closely on the time, so I don't know if my time is up yet, Pravina. But
yeah. All right. Thanks, Julia. I think for the beginning, I am very happy with how you've put the landscape through for us. I think you've set the scene extremely well for us to be able to carry on with the discussion. I really like the fact about, we know what we want. It's now how we actually go about doing it. So I think we can actually explore some of that in our discussion today as well. And so I want to move on to Sean now. Sean, listening to Julia and all of these different documents that she mentioned, insofar as SDG 4, the UNCRPD Article 4, the General Comment 4, linked to Article 24, the IDA flagship report on inclusive education, the UNESCO GEM report. There's so many documents and instruments that we have. Now, I just want you to please, if you could, for our attendees, highlight some of the key principles in these documents, and if you can bring it alive for us, how does it have application for us?
Well, thank you, Pravina, for that introduction. And before going on, I'd just like to thank you also for the invitation to be a panelist in this webinar and be part of this esteemed group of people. And may I also briefly congratulate ONSE, the World Blind Union, and ICVI on making this Congress possible at all. I know it's a year later, but given the circumstances, it's incredible. And when I joined this morning, there were over 4,000 people registered for this event, and many people meeting physically in the auditorium. And I think it's an amazing event and an opportunity to learn, and it shows what people want to learn about. Well, I think you gave me quite a challenge, Pravina, and please excuse me if I also repeat some of what Julia has already said. But I wanted to say, well, why would these instruments be important, and why would this report be important? And I thought maybe I would start with a few statistics. Obviously, the data we know is not perfect, and we are talking in generalizations here, but we are aware that as many as 93 million children with disabilities in the world are amongst them the most likely to be left behind. And we know that Agenda 2030 is to leave no one behind. So how do we meet that challenge? We also are aware that in low and middle income countries, half of the estimated 65 million primary and lower secondary school-aged children with disabilities are out of school. And this morning we were told that 50% of blind children are out of school. 90% of children with disabilities in low middle income countries do not attend school, and very few young people with disabilities transition into higher levels of training and education, and actually very few complete their primary education. However, on a positive note, we do know that with quality education in place, with well-trained teachers and strong peer support, as many as 80 to 90% of learners with disabilities could be educated in mainstream schools with only minor additional support. Well, we started with Article 24, looking at the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I'm pleased to say I was kind of in the room in Brussels when the huge launch was for the CRPD in 2006. And the buzz was tangible of a new movement of people having the same vision of inclusive education, of inclusion, not just in education, but in life, in community life, in livelihood, access to health and welfare, and a real sense of international and national organizations and governments working together to achieve inclusion for all. Yes, we were looking at obviously the call on state parties to ensure an inclusive education system to all as part of lifelong learning. And then later, this was the objective that underpinned the Sustainable Development Goal of inclusive and equitable quality education in promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all, including those with disabilities. So we're starting, and as Julia said, in the Millennium Development Goals, there was no mention of disability, but in the Sustainable Development Goals, there is a strong commitment. And when we come to the general comment for, because what was missing in Article 24 was the detail of the how, what to do, what did governments really need to do. Whereas general comment for started to look at the need or how to train teachers, seeing children as diverse learners with different needs in learning friendly environments, creating those friendly environments. Because when children are happy and confident, they learn better, we know that. Providing the support systems, counselling skills, links to health, social welfare, social protection, partnerships with organisations of persons with disabilities and with parents groups. And really, when we look at our action going forward, we need to all be working together. Because in spite of all these wonderful global commitments, actual translation of quality inclusive education on the ground is still lacking when we look at the whole picture. We have isolated great programs, we have good practices, but actually looking at each and every rural area, looking at the needs of people in urban slums, in socially, economically deprived areas, looking at humanitarian action, we are far from that picture of inclusive education. And it's together with the members of the IDDC, International Disability and Development Consortium, where I also co-coordinate with Julia, the International Disability Alliance, and with the Global Action on Disability, I'm glad, is the way that we can go forward. And if we look at the IDA report, and I think what Julia said, you know, this is what shows us the how. It has the recommendations on good practice, and we can learn from these, and we need to have those messages together as a global community in advocating for inclusive education going forward, in translating these beautiful policies into implemented good practices, and that these good practices become the norm, leading into truly inclusive education systems. It puts forward the minimum conditions that we need. It puts forward a vision of how to create an inclusive education system, including the voices of children with disabilities, and including youth, and including the voices of people with disabilities. The report can inform education sector stakeholders on the priorities agreed by the disability rights movement and equip disability activists and their allies with essential messages and recommendations to unify and strengthen advocacy towards effective and accelerated reforms of the education sector. And moving on again from the Global Education Monitoring Report, I cannot go through the whole Global Education Monitoring Report and do it justice, but I can say that if we learn the key findings and we take note of the key recommendations, there are 10 key recommendations, these are a real source for us to advocate for change. And there's a lot of guidance that we can use to accelerate those changes. The GEM report looks at the social, economic and cultural mechanisms that discriminate against disadvantaged children, youth and adults, keeping them out of education or marginalizing them. Laws by themselves do not achieve. It's what happens on the ground. So it needs to be a combined effort from the ground, from communities, and the GEM report advocates for this, working with organizations of persons with disabilities, working with parents, working with community members, because schools cannot be seen as isolated places on their own. They are structures where children access nutrition, they access play, they access social interaction, but they also access health. And I think we know from the experience that we've had with the COVID-19 crisis, which has exacerbated the underlying inequalities we already had, the importance of provision of education and the importance of inclusive education, because many countries, particularly not only low middle income countries but also higher resource countries, have not been from the get-go able to provide all the accessibility needs that children with disabilities need. And this has highlighted that big gap. So we need to fight and get back better, build back better and build back more inclusively when this pandemic is over. And the report also highlights the lack of data that is available, and particularly how complex the picture is for children with disabilities, and highlights that those with sensory, physical or intellectual disability are 2.5 times more likely to have never been to school as their peers without disabilities. Fewer than 40% of countries in Africa have an inclusive education policy which promotes inclusion for all children, including all children with disabilities. So there's a huge amount of advocacy we need to do and to work together towards truly seeing inclusion and education as a human right. We need to have systemic change. We need the dialogue. We need to make global commitments into local quality provision. And with the second Global Disability Summit coming up in 2022, with IDA as co-leader with the government of Norway and a yet third partner to be announced, I think this is the time that we need a unified voice to be together, to clearly state the messages that we want to see, to go forward, to create the inclusive vision that we have right from the CRPD, right through to the GEM report and going forward. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for that, Sian. I think it's clear to us that we need action from what you've said and what you've highlighted from the various reports. What we require, is outlined, etc. But we need to advocate. We need the dialogue. We need to have unified messaging to enable us to move forward with inclusive education to ensure that our children are not left behind. So thank you so much for bringing those reports alive for us. I now want to move on to Guy. Guy, I understand that you have been involved in research for Sightsavers on inclusive education in sub-Saharan Africa. And as it is in any field, research findings play a significant role on how we can identify challenges and put forward recommendations, etc. Would you please tell us a bit about the research that was conducted by Sightsavers in sub-Saharan Africa and some of the key findings from this research?
Thanks, Pravina. Could you first let me know, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly fine.
Oh, okay, wonderful, thank you. I'd really like to begin, like Sian and Julia, by thanking the organisers of this summit for giving me the opportunity to speak today, and in particular, of course, to Dr. Pravina for organising this seminar. As Pravina said, I will be discussing the educational situation for children with visual impairments in various sub-Saharan African contexts. I will be drawing upon research carried out by Sightsavers from 2019 to 2020, which provided the basis for a background paper for the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on Inclusion. The first point I'd like to make is that there is a lack of reliable quantitative data, as well as qualitative information on education provision for children with visual impairments in Africa. The lack of quantitative data is due to the weakness of data collection systems in the region, including the Education Management Information Systems, or EMISs, of Ministries of Education. The lack of qualitative information is due to the comparatively little case study-based research that's been carried out in the subject. However, it's possible to draw some initial conclusions. First, census data collected from 13 sub-Saharan African countries indicates that children with visual impairments are significantly less likely than other children to go to school, to complete a full course of primary education, and to acquire basic literacy. The data indicates that girls with visual impairments are less likely to go to school than boys, although it also indicates that those girls enrolled in education tend to achieve better education outcomes than boys. Encouragingly, the data indicates that the educational situation for children with visual impairments, particularly girls, has significantly improved in recent decades. Less encouragingly, the disability gap between children with visual impairments and other children has remained the same over this period. Second, EMIS data indicates that significant numbers of children with visual impairments continue to be enrolled in special schools, particularly in Anglophone countries such as Kenya, Uganda, and Zambia. Third, various case studies of education provision for children with visual impairments in sub-Saharan Africa provide a mixed picture. A study of mainstream primary schools in Senegal, supported by an NGO, concluded that the children were receiving an education of good quality. The teachers were practicing reasonable accommodation to meet the needs of these children, for instance, relaying what they had written on the board so these children could hear it. The children received individualized support such as Braille tuition and orientation and mobility instruction, and were provided with necessary assistive technology. The schools provided social environments in which the children with visual impairments and their peers supported one another's learning and development inside and outside the classroom. Efforts had also been made to make the schools more physically accessible for children with visual impairments. For instance, through removing obstacles from grounds and corridors so the children could travel about more easily. In summary, provision in these schools was inclusive, as defined by Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. However, case studies of education provision in mainstream schools in South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Nigeria, Ghana, and Nigeria provide a more worrying picture. In these studies, it was reported that a significant proportion of teachers lacked the necessary commitment and capacity to teach children with visual impairments, that children did not access necessary assistive technology, even sometimes basic technology, that schools were sometimes physically dangerous places because of the state of their infrastructure for children with visual impairments, and there was a high incidence of bullying and teasing. So what can be done to improve this situation? Here are a few thoughts for your consideration. 1, we need to collect more and better data and information. How can we hope to improve education situations when we don't fully understand them? 2, we need to strengthen education systems so they meet A, the requirements of all learners, and B, meet the specific requirements of students with disabilities. In short, we need to adopt a twin track approach. 3, How will we find out if education provision is inclusive for children with visual impairments? Through asking the children themselves. They are the best judges of this matter. 4, there needs to be much greater investment in the education of those children with more complex support needs, such as children with deaf-blindness. Too often they are forgotten. 5, education is not just about schooling. In particular, there's a need to develop the capacity of families to provide early childhood stimulation for children with visual impairments, and then support these children through the subsequent stages of childhood and adolescence. 6, to ensure students with visual impairments access joined-up services, policy makers and implementers need to adopt a multi-sectoral approach. For instance, if good quality pediatric eye care services are in place, children with refractive error will receive the customized spectacles that will help them to succeed in education. 7, education reform happens from the top down as well as the bottom up. We not only need to engage with local stakeholders, but national governments. In particular, education sector plans and budgets need to address the specific needs of children with visual impairments. 8, we need to strengthen the links between education and employment to ensure young adults with visual impairments can enter the world of work and secure meaningful, satisfying employment. 9, mindful of the saying, nothing without us. Organizations of people with disabilities, including blind people's associations, should play a leading role in policy making and implementation. And 10, mindful of the saying, we are stronger together than apart. It's very important that blind people's associations in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere continue to work closely with other disability organizations to achieve system-wide change. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I hope we will have the opportunity to discuss some of these points later in our seminar.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Guy. I think those recommendations are most welcome. I think I've already gotten requests for the presentation as well. And we're also getting a lot of questions from our attendees on the chat. So we certainly would hope to address some of those questions in our Q&A session. However, I think your recommendations that you put forward already have answered a few of those questions. Thank you once again, Guy, for that excellent presentation. I want to now move to Prof. Kay Farrell. Kay, we've been hearing about the challenges that we face with implementing inclusive education. Guy has mentioned but a few, including Julia, including Sean. I wanted to just touch, want you to put forward for us, what have you found in terms of the practical challenges in your experience with teaching children with low vision and blindness at school?
Well, thank you, Pravina. I also want to add my thanks to ONSE and to the World Blind Union and ICEVI, and especially to you, Pravina, for coordinating this workshop, this webinar, and I appreciate the comments that we've had so far because they repeat a lot of what I'm going to say. I think it is important to note that the education of visually impaired students has been way ahead of other disability fields. We started integration in the early 1900s when a class was created for students with visual impairment in the Chicago public schools. In the 1960s, we began to see more children attending public schools, sometimes served by an itinerant teacher who was trained to educate blind children, and she would drive around from school to school as children's needs arose. But we need to remember that in some situations, what we now refer to as inclusive education was simply education, the one system that the IDA, International Disability Alliance, refers to in its flagship report. However, these early days of inclusive education tended to affect only those students with mild visual impairment, essentially students who did not require a great deal of external support. They were easily served by itinerant teachers of students with visual impairments until the student became independent. Mainstreaming is a term that was widely used in the 1970s, but it pretty much refers to placing a student in a general education classroom. Integration and inclusion does this too, but the difference lies in the philosophy behind the two movements. A mainstream student may have slight adjustments in how she is assessed, but she learns mostly the same material, perhaps with books provided in Braille or large type, as though she were placed in the current of a fast-running stream without an anchor or even a raft. Integration is the process in which children with special needs are absorbed into the mainstream or the general education system. So with integration, students are in the stream, but indistinguishable from their peers. The concept of inclusion, on the other hand, is based on the idea that students with disabilities should not be segregated, but should be included in a classroom with their typically developing peers, with supports and accommodations to place them on an equal footing with these peers. My own philosophy is that children with visual impairments have the right to attend the same school they would be attending if they did not have a visual impairment in the first place. But as you suggest, this creates a unique set of challenges for student and teacher, some of which have already been mentioned. One of the challenges is lack of expertise. Teachers teach the way they were taught, which is generally visually. We, as specialists in education of blind children, are trained to teach non-visually, to translate, if you will, the visual into tactile or auditory information. I've always said that visual impairment affects how a child learns, not what a child learns. Another challenge is the attitudes and beliefs of teachers and school administrators who believe that children with disabilities cannot learn or do not have the same potential as children without disabilities. These administrators and teachers simply do not have enough experience yet with children with disabilities. Another challenge is the lack of comprehensive services. Just opening the doors, as Julia said, or accessible books are not enough. They're important, but not enough. We have to consider the technology, the multiple formats that exist, giving children the choice of formats to learn in the way they want to, the tactile ways of learning mathematics with and without assistive devices, orientation and mobility, videos with description, and turning tactile information into concepts. And another challenge is the limited time and commitment we have to building partnerships. We are all overworked. We need time to implement, and it's 9 years until SDG 4 is supposed to be a reality. Is 9 years going to be enough? We need to make clear the distinction between mainstreaming and inclusion. The benefits to inclusion are not always easily or immediately realized. For example, I have seen classrooms where a student sits alone or doesn't have books and materials in a format that he can access. Or a blind student, I've seen a blind student trying to reconnoiter the playground without any assistance. Or the child who is not invited to birthday parties and other social events. At the same time, one of my blind students used to stumble over her classmates during circle time, expected to find an empty spot to sit down. Her classmates let her trip over or step on them. They didn't correct her, but didn't give her help either. And neither did the teacher, probably because someone told that teacher to, quote unquote, let her do it herself, don't intervene. I intervened instead. Sometimes intervention is crucial and more efficient than letting a child grope, but you have to know how to intervene. And again, teachers teach the way they were taught unless they've been trained. A child can be included in general education classes, but be more segregated mentally and socially than if he or she attended a specialized school. I've taught in both settings. The challenge is to individualize the educational program for any child at any point in time, and to recognize that children move in and out of their social and educational environments based on how they are doing at that point in time. I believe SDG 4 is an attainable goal, but I fear that simply implementing inclusive education without providing supports and accommodations is simply not realistic. It can also be harmful, And I worry that we risk exacerbating a generation of students unless fundamental changes are made to the culture and mores of the educational system, regardless of the country. Inclusion is not just about place. It is also about friendship, acceptance, honoring diversity, universal design for learning. It's about philosophy, supports, access to the curriculum, instruction by qualified teachers, and true integration. It is not about Western-centric research or what works in Western developed countries, such as pushing independence at all costs, when independence may not be valued by the culture the child lives in. Inclusion is beneficial to all children, not just those with disabilities. Inclusion is not an afterthought. It is not an exception. And it is a place where a child learns to read and write, a child who is able to do things rather than just observing, who does things that everyone else does, and where his or her hands are not idle. Nothing is more telling than a blind child sitting in a classroom with his or her hands folded in his or her lap. And inclusion is never a child sitting alone. Those are some of the challenges that I see, Pravina.
Thank you so much for that, Kay. It's so thought-provoking. I think it really shows the multifaceted discussion that this panel is offering in terms of experience and expertise. And thank you so much for sharing that end of the spectrum and the challenges that we do face, and also for highlighting the difference between mainstreaming, integration, and inclusion. And clearly, inclusion is very in-depth. You cannot just place a child somewhere in a school, in a classroom, and say that you're including them if you're not giving them the relevant support. And we know that support is very diverse in what a child requires and differs from individual child to individual child. Thanks for that, Kay. I want to now move on to Jordi. Jordi, this is a very important question that you are going to address us on. Can you describe the roles of international non-governmental organizations, national non-governmental organizations, OPDs, civil societies, etc., in terms of advocacies, strategies, networking, collaboration, and partnerships to assist with the promotion and sustainability of inclusive education?
Thank you very much for that question, Dr. Pravina. I just have to start to say that I am on the countryside, so my internet might be breaking up, so please let me know if you can't hear me.
Will do.
Thank you. So I just wanted actually to follow up of a very interesting experience that we in the Norwegian Association of the Blind and Partially Sighted, so NABP, are having right now with the project that we are working on. The project is called Together for Inclusion. It's a big project with about 16 NGO and DPO partners.
Jody, you're breaking up a bit. Jody, it seems your internet connection is unstable.
Yes, would you allow me to change over to my phone? So you can just let the next speaker change, and then I will try a different internet. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. I'm going to move on to Anna, and then when you will just send me a message in the chat. Anna, I want to now move on to you. You know, we always hearing about technology now being a game changer in education for children with disabilities and children with visual impairment in particular. I wanted to find out your thoughts on what you see the role of technology as being, and do you see it assisting learners with visual impairments to learn alongside their sighted peers? Anna, you mute currently. Can you just
Sorry,
unmute?
perdón.
Thank
Muchas
you.
gracias, doctora Pravina, por la pregunta y buenas tardes, días, noches a todas y a todos los que estén conectados a este panel. Primero, dar las gracias por dejarme participar con este grupo de expertos que, por supuesto, saben muchísimo más a nivel global de la inclusión. Yo os puedo hablar de lo que pasa en España y de la labor que hace la ONCE. Y sí, nosotros consideramos que la tecnología es un aliado más en el avance hacia la inclusión educativa de los niños y las niñas en España y, por supuesto, en cualquier otro país. Es verdad que la tecnología a veces también nos pone trabas importantes y yo creo que después de este año de pandemia hemos sido conscientes, ¿no?, de las limitaciones que puede suponer si no se tienen en cuenta el tema de la accesibilidad, ¿no? Podemos encargarnos, ¿no?, desde la propia escuela o desde las entidades de apoyo a las personas con discapacidad visual en introducir el uso de la tecnología de manera temprana, ¿no? En los niños podemos luchar por conseguir una dotación adecuada de ordenadores o de tabletas para que puedan seguir las clases con estos materiales, pero si al final la accesibilidad no es la adecuada, no conseguimos nada. Ejemplos, ¿no? Nosotros, por ejemplo, hemos desarrollado un método de lectoescritura que se llama Braille-Pico y que no está reñido con la tecnología. Tiene una gran parte de ese método, usa la tecnología. El Braille y la tecnología no están reñidos. Diríamos que se complementan, ¿no? Es fundamental. Nosotros, después de hacer un importante estudio, nos dimos cuenta que un niño ciego no le podemos hacer nosotros diferente al resto de los niños. Si todos sus amigos y compañeros usan tecnología, nosotros no podemos pretender que accedan o que conozcan o que aprendan un código de lectoescritura dejando aparte la tecnología. Los resultados son maravillosos porque al final los niños, al enseñarles el braille junto con la tecnología, se sienten más cerca de sus compañeros, ¿no? Es una medida totalmente inclusiva y además que el método es un método que también sirve para enseñar a leer y a escribir a cualquier otro niño que no sea ciego, ¿no? Pero también tenemos las experiencias de que la accesibilidad siempre es lo último. Se desarrollan plataformas educativas y muchos recursos educativos, ¿no? En los que la accesibilidad es algo que viene después, no se plantea desde el inicio, ¿no? Y luego es muy difícil que estos recursos se hagan accesibles. Y es tan sencillo hacerlos accesibles desde el primer momento y además no están reñidos para nada con el diseño. Un recurso accesible también puede ser atractivo. Y esa es nuestra lucha, el reclamar a las administraciones educativas, a las empresas que se encargan de realizar diseños de este tipo para que la discapacidad visual no sea algo que moleste, ¿no? Algo que siempre está pidiendo, reivindicando algo. No, los niños y las niñas son ciudadanos de pleno derecho. La educación es un derecho, por lo tanto, lo que no puede ser es que la comunidad educativa sea quien les deje fuera por no, bueno, cuando solicitan o cuando se ponen a realizar una plataforma educativa por no tener en cuenta la accesibilidad. Y a veces son cosas tan sencillas, ¿no? No me hagas un PDF imagen, hazme un PDF texto, que puede estar protegido y además puede ser no manipulable si quieres, ¿no? O sea, hay cosas muy sencillas y nuestro trabajo pues muchas veces consiste en explicar, ¿no? Y en hacer entender a la sociedad. Por suerte cada vez hay más gente que nos escucha. La tecnología para nosotros, para las personas con discapacidad visual, nos da muchísimas posibilidades en cuanto a la comunicación y en cuanto a la formación y en cuanto a la conexión con el entorno, en cuanto a sentirnos iguales, ¿no?, con los demás y también para incluirnos socialmente, ¿no?, para un futuro trabajo. Hoy en día el que no maneje la tecnología tampoco va a poder desarrollar determinadas profesiones y esa es una de nuestras reivindicaciones. Desde luego en España vivimos en un momento más de integración que de inclusión. La inclusión todavía son buenas prácticas, estamos dando muchos pasos y sí que confiamos que dentro de cuando pasen esos 9 años, ¿no? En el 2030, sí que se haya dado el paso hacia adelante. Comparto muchas de las cosas que habéis contado y la inclusión no puede ser un precepto único. La inclusión siempre tiene que ir de la mano con la calidad y con la equidad, porque podemos pensar o podemos crear un sistema educativo paralelo en el que los niños compartan aulas, pero que nadie se dedique a enseñarles lo mismo que a los demás. Tenemos que pedir que la escuela se vuelva inclusiva, pero con unos criterios de calidad y de equidad. Y entonces así avanzaremos. Me he quedado sin audio.
Thank you, Anna. I think you summed that up really well for us. Clearly, technology opens doors not only for children in education, but also to lead them into employment and for their independent living going forward. Jordi, I see you back on. If you would do your presentation now.
Yes,
Jordi?
thank you, Dr.
Yes,
Pravina. I will try again. I hope you
All
can
right.
hear me this time.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So actually, I just wanted to pick up on Kay's presentation, talking about practical challenges with inclusive education. So I wanted to talk about a very practical on-the-ground experience that we are having in NABP. NABP is the Norwegian Association of the Blind and Partially Sighted. We are participating in a new Norwegian initiative called Together for Inclusion, or TOFI for short, where we are 16 NGO partners and DPO partners in Norway, together with our local partners in 6 African countries. And inclusive education is one of the main impact areas that we are working on. So one of the great things about TOFI, or at least this is what we think in NABP, is that there is a DPO lead. So for us, this is an essential part of Nothing About Us Without Us, right? We are in the lead. So for NABP's case, we are leading the implementation of the consortium in Mozambique. Of course, that there are some challenges to this collaboration. But first, I just wanted to highlight some of the benefits, because what we have realized and what we have been talking about today is that if we really want to create systemic change, and if we want to get to quality education, then DPOs, we cannot work alone. So we cannot work isolated. We need to work together to reach that goal. So one of the objectives actually for the TOFI project is mainstreaming persons with disabilities into the program of NGOs. And we work with NGOs that don't normally work with persons with disabilities. So they are not used to doing this work. And how we work with it is focusing on joint implementation. This is something that we as a DPO has been pushing quite hard on. What we see when we work very closely together with our DPO and NGO partners is that the NGO partners have good intentions. They have the intention to include persons with disabilities, children with disabilities, in their program activities, in their education programs. And when I talk about the partners, I just want to be clear that I talk about our Norwegian partners and also, in this specific case, our partners in Mozambique. So we see that the intentions are very good, but what we experience is that the understanding that our partners have of disability tend to be a bit narrow. And now I'm going to speak a bit bluntly, so you might be provoked, but often they focus very much on persons who have a disability, have a difficulty to walk. So for NGO partners, often disability equals wheelchair, right? And we all know that working to include learners with disability into education, it's much more complex than that, right? There is a whole range of issues that we have to think about, that we have to accommodate, and that we have to change to actually reach inclusion. So what we are concluding from this work is that there is great potential when we work together, right? We can work with broadening the understanding of what the disability actually mean, and how you can work with different types of learners to include them in education. And there is great potential in working with professionalizing the way that our NGO partners work with children with disabilities. So then I just want to talk a bit about joint implementation, because as I said, it's very important that we work together. So we can't work in silos, because then it's very difficult to change and improve the way that we work with inclusive education. And this is a learning. So obviously this is the case for our partners, and this is also the case for NABP. On the other hand, if we work with joint implementation, we are forced to understand how our partners think about inclusion. And we learn the way and the working methods that they use to reach an inclusive education. And that means that we can also point out when we need them to change, when we do not agree with their understanding of inclusion, or when we think that they should change the way that they work. So this means that we have a constant discussion in the consortium on what is inclusion, who are we going to include, and how are we going to do it. And then I just wanted to go and give a very practical example. I mean, there are many things that we could have talked about, but one of the things that you have been talking about is, how we are unsure of data, and how we need more data on inclusion, and we need more data on how to include children with disabilities in education. One thing that we do know is that a huge problem for inclusive education is that many children are out of school. So due to lack of data, we have some studies from Mozambique, for example, from 2009, conducted by the Norwegian academic institution SINTEF, and they estimated that 43% of children with disabilities in Mozambique had never gone to school. And obviously, if you add all the children then that did start school and then dropped out, I mean, it's a high number of children who are out of school. So we have a huge challenge here to actually find those children who are out of school, enroll them in school, and ensure that they complete their education and benefit from the education that they are given. So right now, as a consequence of that, we are discussing in the consortium, and we are working on planning identification of out-of-school children with disabilities. And I just wanted to highlight two challenges that we have in that work. So the first one, it's rather obvious, of course, it's the power relations. Because we work, as DPOs, we work with quite big NGOs that tend to be larger. They have more staffing, they have specialized staff, and they are accustomed to lead and to tell us what to do. So the first challenge that we have is actually raising our voice and keep up with the implementation, because our partners work extremely fast to please our donors. And we need to keep up with that implementation and then raise our voice and challenge our partners when we disagree and when we think that we need a discussion. The other challenge that we have is about who we should identify. And we've already talked a bit about this today. I think in the consortium, we have three views, I would say, in our discussion. We have the partners that would like to include all learners who are out of school. And the argument is saying that when a child has a disability and that child is out of school, the reason for the child being out of school is not a disability, but other barriers that could be removed to ensure that the child attends school. It could be attitude, could be economy, It could be distance to school, for example. And then we have other partners, and I already talked a bit about this, who group all children, who work with children with disabilities, and then group all children with disabilities into one group. And the challenge with this, obviously, is that you have to look at diversity. You have to look at how children are diverse and how they have diverse needs, and how we need to adapt the system so that they can get the education that they need. For example, it's not enough to work with only the physical environment. When we work specifically with children who have visual impairments, obviously we need to look at other issues. We need to look at didactic material, for example, etc. So our worry is that if we generalize too much and we put all children into, one group, then we can't see the individual. And then the last point of that discussion is our view. So NABP is an organization for persons with visual impairments, and then obviously when we work with international development work, we focus on children and learners with visual impairments. The challenge that we see, and that we've seen while working with identification, is that when specialized organizations train institutions to do identification on, let's say, children with visual impairments, then they will do identification of only children with visual impairments, right? But we know that, at least 50% of children with disabilities in Mozambique are out of school. And then we will leave this whole group of children behind if we only identify the children with visual impairments. So our challenge then is saying, okay, how can we collaborate with our DPO partners and NGO partners to make sure that we identify, enroll all of these children and make sure that they can benefit from education? So, we are still working on how we are going to design the identification process. We have not concluded our discussions yet. We are still talking, we are still designing. So if anyone from the panel or anyone listening here have any inputs, we are very happy to receive it. So just to summarize what I've been talking about, I've just made a case for joint implementation with NGOs and DPOs to promote inclusive education. And I think there are some obvious challenges here, but from NABP side, we see that the benefits definitely are greater than the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordi. I think I'm actually so glad that your internet started working, or we would have missed out on such a great presentation. And I think a lot of the DPOs and NGOs here today have benefited immensely from this presentation. So thank you very much. I think listening to all our panelists so far today, it's clear that we have several challenges insofar as certain countries have policies on inclusive education. However, implementation is very difficult on the ground. We have situations where we've got teachers that are not yet trained to even embrace and include children with visual impairments in mainstream setups. We've got situations where we know technology is going to assist children with visual impairments to be included in mainstream classrooms. However, we don't have a technology strategy. The costs of the technology within national governments, etc., pose challenges. There's still special education systems alongside inclusive education systems, rather than building specialization, etc., within a single education system for all learners. I think these are some of the challenges that we have picked up on during our discussions today. And I think one of the key things is naturally budgeting and financing for inclusive education. I just want Julia to highlight for us what are certain cost initiatives, finance initiatives that are in place for inclusive education, across the world. What are the budgeting trends that are happening so that we can see, are governments actually putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to implementing inclusive education? Julia, if you could, just in 3 minutes, just to tell us what's out there.
I'll be brief. Unfortunately, the news is not as good as we might have hoped, although I'll end with a positive. But I will start with the reality that even before COVID, there was an education crisis in terms of financing, and we can't, deny that. A staggering 148 billion annual financing gap in low and lower middle income countries to achieve SDG 4 from now until 2030. And that's just in general. And I won't go through all the details, only to say that only 9% of OECD marked aid, so that's Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, their aid was found to be targeted for the purpose of disability inclusion. So it's very hard to find data about the costings. Sometimes it's not well earmarked, but just to say, so it's a really small percentage that's clearly, earmarked for disability inclusion in general. And as many people have stated, 50% at least of children with disabilities are excluded currently out of school. So the situation is pretty dire, and it has got worse since COVID. However, there is some good news. So I'll try and focus on the good news stories. But if you do want to know more about the situation, about the global funding in education declining and what's happening, I would like to just refer you to it's a few years old now, but the costing equity report that IGDC produced is a valuable place to go. So I won't go through it now because we've only got a few minutes, but I will put the link and people can go and look through that themselves to see some of the trends in the financing, which unfortunately isn't so great. However, let's be positive. There has been some recent financial initiatives which have focused on inclusive education. So I'll highlight a couple here. One is the Inclusive Education Initiative, which was launched at the Global Disability Summit that some of you might remember in 2018. Which is a sort of multi-donor trust fund focused entirely on inclusive education. And I think the thing to say about that is, it's not just another pot of money for inclusive education, in the sense it's trying to create global public goods on the topic. So, that hopefully is for everybody to share, be open source and people to use across the world. So these kind of initiatives really trying to bring all the pieces together, as well as having sort of country-focused interventions. And the other thing to highlight is that donors, or mainstream donors that previously may not have been, focusing on inclusion or thinking about inclusion, are starting to do that. And so that does both give us some hope for the future, because as I said at the outset, financing is a huge crisis and we can't deny that. But the fact that donors like the World Bank have made commitments to ensure all their education programming is going to be inclusive by 2025, which is soon, should, hopefully give us some hope that, there should be some more larger amounts going into this in the next few years. Because as we've all said, this costs money. If we want technology, if we want the accessible resources, we're going to need to, put essential, the amount of funding that we need to do that. So this has to be large amounts. And I think if I've got my 3 minutes, they're probably up by now, Pravina, so I won't mention any more, but I'll add a few links in the chat box if anybody wants to know about any other resources mentioning financing, because there's a lot to say, unfortunately, at the moment about what the needs are, but also some of the positive initiatives that are happening too.
Okay, thanks, Julia. I think if you could forward us the links, and then I will put it on the website, because unfortunately attendees cannot see the chat itself. So we will upload it, because I think it would be great if attendees can see what are some of the initiatives that are out there, so that, and to determine whether their countries can actually participate in those initiatives. And so I think that would be key. So thank you so much. I know it's just that there's so much to talk about, and we can't, 90 minutes is just too little time, but thank you for that. And I think our attendees have gotten something out of that. I mean, the Inclusive Education Initiative is out there from the World Bank, etc. So those are things that resources we could touch on, we could utilize. I want to now ask Sean. Sean, I know that there are certain critical factors on inclusive education and to implement inclusive education. And we've heard so much that our panelists have said in terms of the diversity, and this is because of the diverse panel of experts that we do have. But I know that CBM has put together an inclusive education toolbox that can be used, I'm sure, and will benefit a lot of countries when trying to implement inclusive education. Can you just briefly tell us a little bit about the toolbox in a few more minutes?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I wouldn't call it one particular toolbox, but there are some publications and documents that certainly we use with our partners and in country, through country offices, to help guide our partner work. And in case some of you don't know, but CBM has been in existence for over 100 years, since 1908. So I would say we're an organization that has seen the trend of, the beginning of specialized education, the provision of special schools. And I would say that in those earlier days, CBM would have been amongst the bigger organizations in the provision of schools for children who are blind, schools for children who are deaf. And so we've come through that and then walked with the sort of the integration model came on board, and then the inclusive education approach. And throughout all of these approaches and right across this journey, I would say there are challenges, there are barriers, and there are opportunities in each of these steps that have been as we've gone forward. As I mentioned, we started off with our supporting special schools, and we continue to support our special schools as they transition to becoming inclusive education resource centers. And what we feel has been important is not to focus just inclusive education and training on teachers in mainstream schools or pre-service teachers, i.e. student teachers who are coming through the system, but actually also introducing inclusive education, training in inclusive education to specialist teachers, because they too don't fully understand what's required and what inclusive education really means, and are sometimes fearful of it. So there's a kind of fear on both sides of the divide, is the way I would say I've experienced the provision of inclusive education through our partners. And I would say in the sort of CBM toolbox, I would say we're also sharing good documents and guidance from other organizations as we sit in this room today, from HI, from Sightsavers, from IDDC. So there's a whole plethora of information out there, I think, that people can access to learn more about the approach for inclusive education. We recognize that inclusive education is for the benefit of all learners, and that, however, that some children will need specialist support. And I think we've heard this today from Kay, from Geordie, from Guy as well, and from Anna Isabel from Spain. If we take away some of the specifics, underlying those are very common issues that we're all facing. And I think in the early days of provision, be it particularly around maybe to the integration, moving into inclusion, there was a sense that we were, and when I say we there, I think as a global community, were tending to bring in northern practices into southern context. And this wasn't always, and still isn't always, the right way to go about the provision. Because clearly there is no one size that fits all, and that's one of the things the Global Education Monitoring Report emphasized. There is no one size fits all, and that we do need to adapt to the contexts that we're working in. And we recognize that all children can reach their potential, and I think it was Guy who mentioned about early identification, and certainly for CBM, working in the community, because for us inclusion starts at birth. A child is born into a family, and that family needs to understand how to support a child with a disability. What kind of early interventions, what kind of early stimulation, what kind of way can they help to support a child in order to reduce the impact of disability and improve their opportunities for inclusion within their own family, within their own community. But this does have challenges, because enrolling children in school is not enough. That is not inclusion. And we've heard that as a theme today in several of the themes that have come up. Children need to participate in school, family and community life. And so what are the guides then that we're, the kind of toolbox that we have for our partners and our country offices? Well, first we have a reference guide on inclusive education, which is a kind of highlight really of indicating the difference between special, integrated, inclusive. What are the ingredients? What can happen at a community level for in order to create inclusive education, and what kind of ideas can partners look for? What kind of indicators can they look to use in terms of developing project proposals? The Disability Inclusive Development Toolkit has been around for a few years now, but is still relevant in terms of training on providing information on the twin track approach, inclusion of persons with disabilities, working with organizations of persons with disabilities. In 2018, we published the My Right is Our Future, the Transformative Power of Disability Inclusive Education book, where again gave an overview of what inclusive education is for those who wanted to delve more deeply into how to put inclusive education into action. And very relevant for us today, came on board with the CBM Digital Accessibility Toolkit, because clearly as learning has gone online and through various media, then clearly a lot of our partners are working with their governments to try and create accessibility via digital media. We're about to publish a desk report on UDL and the role of UDL and how it's practiced, research has practiced in low middle income countries. And that will be published at the Global Education Summit on July the 27th. And also literally coming online, and I'll share that link with you, Pravina, is the CBM Training Guide on Inclusive Education, which is, I would say, a training guide, not that you start at A and go to D and that you need to go through each step, but rather a training guide which is full of questions, frequently asked questions around inclusive education, so that participants can select the questions that they are most interested in. And each question has background information for the facilitator, and then activities to support those questions in terms of participatory discussion, looking at, there are 4 modules, and the first one looks at CBM and its own federation strategy.
Sean?
Yes, I can see. I'm just coming to the end.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I'll just finish there, I think, and then hopefully there'll be some questions and I'll share the link with you.
Yes, thanks. I think if you could share the link, I mean, there's clearly resources that we could all benefit from. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that, and I will then share it with the WBS.
Yes, thank you.
I see we are actually into the Q&A time currently. So I'm just going to quickly raise one of the questions with Kay. In terms of teacher training, what have you found with regard to teacher training for including children with visual impairments? What have been your observations? Do you think it has anything to do with attitudes, incentivization, capacity? Can you just touch on that briefly for us, Kay? It's one of the questions that we have received.
Well, it has to do with all of the above, everything that you've said. that we talk a lot about universal design for learning. Why don't we talk about universally designed teachers? It's because there's so much content that they have to get. You need to strike a balance between traditional training of teachers, the way we've done it, the way I've done it for 35 years, and training teachers for all children. Do we really expect teachers to learn sign language, Braille, and accessible technology in addition to subject matter content? To me, it's a conundrum. I don't know how we're going to get around this. Team teaching would work, but that's only successful in countries that have the economic infrastructure to do that. One teacher for subject matter content and one for creating access. This is more of an itinerant model. I don't know. I just don't think this part of training teachers is solved. I think it is attitudes and it's lack of experience, that the teachers who are regular classroom teachers just haven't had the training, or maybe they've had one course in which all disabilities are thrown in, and hopefully you can change their attitudes, but you really can't change their skills with one course, especially when we're looking at the needs of children with visual impairment.
Thank you, Kay. Another question, I think I want to pose this to Ana. Ana, I mean, there are various challenges, and as you said, even in Spain, it's difficult to actually include children. It's more into something of integration. What about children with visual impairments who have multiple disabilities? Do you feel what happens in Spain, and what do you think should happen in other countries? Do you think they should also be included, and if so, how? I mean, my view would be they should be, but I'm not sure what what the practice has been in Spain and what your observations have been in other countries. If you could briefly just share that with us in a minute, Ana.
Sí, en España los niños con otras discapacidades añadidas a la discapacidad visual hoy en día todavía están en una gran parte segregados en la educación especial. Ningún niño exclusivamente con discapacidad visual está en un centro de educación especial, están todos incluidos, integrados, ¿no?, en centros ordinarios, pero sí que aquellos que tienen otras graves, sobre todo otras graves discapacidades visuales, otro tipo de discapacidad además de la visual, sí que tienen serias dificultades para ir a un centro ordinario. Hay múltiples sistemas en España, desde un aula de inclusión dentro de un centro ordinario hasta las aulas de educación especial en los centros de educación especial. La discapacidad visual no es una discapacidad que impida la inclusión, nunca lo puede impedir. Es una discapacidad que se puede trabajar desde la escuela siempre y cuando se cumplan muchos requisitos, ¿no? Como es la formación adecuada de los profesionales, los recursos adecuados y tener en cuenta desde la comunidad educativa un pilar fundamental en la educación de los niños, que son las familias, ¿no? No solo en aquello de lo curricular, sino en aquello de lo emocional, en aquello que tiene que ver con el entorno, con el tema social y el desarrollo de esas competencias sociales. La nueva ley educativa que tenemos en España, que se ha publicado en diciembre del 2020, sí que planifica en 10 años la evolución de esa parte de la educación especial que afecta más a otro tipo de discapacidades, ¿no?, hacia dejar de ser centros de educación especial. Nosotros tenemos un ejemplo en España. Nosotros convertimos nuestros centros específicos de educación especial hace muchos años, casi podría decir que 35 o 36 años, en centros de recursos educativos, ¿no?, como centros donde se aglutina el saber y la experiencia y desde donde poder orientar y apoyar a toda la comunidad educativa, a las familias y a los propios niños, para que la escuela sea más inclusiva y sea más amable con los niños. Ese es el paso que tenemos que dar ahora en España. Hay bastantes reticencias. Esto ocurre en muchos países. Antes no me acuerdo quién decía que no tiene que ver con países de más alto o menos nivel. Hay países con alto nivel, incluso en Europa, que consideran que cualquier niño con discapacidad tiene que educarse segregadamente, ¿no? Y yo creo que ahora si de verdad los gobiernos se toman en serio lo planificado para el 2030, sí que podremos empezar a dar esos primeros pasos y conseguir que todos los niños, sin diferencia, tengan la discapacidad que tengan, puedan compartir espacio, ¿no? Y no solo espacio, sino desarrollo de competencias a sus niveles, ¿no? En centros educativos, que no solo favorecerán a estos niños, sino que favorecerán a toda la sociedad y a todos los niños, dado que la discapacidad también aporta a la sociedad.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna, for summing that up so well for us. We have come to the end of our webinar today, and I think we have all learned so much from our panel of experts. There are so many other burning questions, but time does not permit, and I'm sure we will be able to get it from the written presentations that will be submitted. I want to take this opportunity to extend my sincere thanks to our panel of experts for sharing such excellent presentations and contributions with us today. And most importantly, I want to thank you, the attendees, for attending the webinar this afternoon. And I trust that you would have learned a lot from what has been presented here today. I want to say, please enjoy the remainder of the World Blindness Summit and the various webinars and proceedings that will still take place in the next 3 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pravina.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thanks.
Thank you, Pravina, and thank you all. Nice to be with you all. Bye.
Yeah, bye everyone.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.